Chapter 2, Police History, Part 3. We're going to divide American policing history up into three different eras: the political era, the professional era, and the community policing era. Now these are rough periods, and you shouldn't take the times that we have here completely literally. For instance, you see here the political era of American policing runs from the 1830s to the 1920s. Those are approximate times. We are still doing a lot of the things that were done in the political era. We're still doing them today. And so it's not like when the era ended that the practices that the police were engaged in just completely disappeared. So we'll still find in modern policing elements of the political era, certainly of the professional era, and we're going to talk about that we are supposedly in the community policing era, and it's even questionable whether we're really doing much community policing, but we'll get to all that in just a little bit. The political era of policing, this is really the first era when modern police departments are coming to America. And so we have, as you recall from the last lesson, the creation of a modern police department in London in 1829, and the concept of a professional police department soon spreads across the world, but obviously to America as well. And so we see the beginnings of police departments in the United States, especially in the Northeast, in the 1830s, the 1840s, during this early period. Now, policing develops in a haphazard way in the U.S. because, as we've said earlier, policing is decentralized in the United States. There's no central agency or institution that's controlling the development of policing across the United States in a very organized way. Instead, it's haphazard. Each city is creating their own police department, and so there are going to be differences from one city to the next. There are going to be similarities, but there are also going to be differences. Now, as we talk about the political era, it's important to note that we're mainly talking about policing in the American Northeast, and mostly in cities, even somewhat the American Upper Midwest, and to some extent the West Coast, although the West Coast wasn't really very much developed during this time period. But if you were to concentrate, as we will a little bit later, on policing in the South and the western frontier of the United States, then you would see a much different style of policing. It wasn't so much the political era of policing there. So try to keep that in mind as we go through. We're mainly talking about northeastern policing and maybe upper Midwest policing. So places like New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, even stretching a little bit farther south to St. Louis. These kinds of cities, these were more characterized by the political era than the western frontier and the South. So the first era of policing, as we said, is known as the political era. It's also sometimes called the graft or spoils era, because we're going to see that there was a lot of bias in policing, and also a lot of corruption, a lot of financial corruption, kickbacks, all kinds of things like that. So it wasn't necessarily by any means a honest, clean era of policing. We're going to see that politics really muddied the waters a lot. So what are some of the key things that were happening in America, especially in the Northeast, when policing was developing? So it's important to know the context in which policing was developing in the United States, because it's a different context than the development of the police in England, for instance, where you had established communities, cities that were growing, but still they weren't facing the same kinds of necessarily the same kinds of things that and the same kinds of developments as American cities. So in England you had cities that were well established like London, and their population was certainly growing, and they were being affected by things like urbanization and industrialization, things that we'll talk about with the American policing, but they weren't growing as rapidly as in the United States. They weren't experiencing immigration as to the extent of the United States. People were leaving England to come to the United States instead of vice versa. And so American policing as well as American law and American society, is really characterized by really quick development, at least relatively speaking. So you have places, for instance, like Chicago, that go from being a little outpost with a few thousand people at the beginning of the 1800s to a city of over 1 million, which was quite large for the time, by the mid-1800s. And so you have nothing comparable in England or the rest of Europe. And so America is all about, at least during this period, kind of learning on the fly, developing a police department, developing laws, developing the country. The country is expanding greatly during this time period, and with immigration, the population is expanding tremendously. And so Americans are dealing with this all really quickly and having to adapt without perhaps a whole lot of thought and planning. And so it's America's, maybe we're kind of known for that, even as a people, the ability to adapt and kind of wing it as we go. It's not always, doesn't always produce good results, but that's kind of the American way, so to speak. But if we look at its effect on policing, what we have is this rapid urbanization. More and more people are coming to cities, and cities are growing tremendously. A lot of that is because of our third factor there, which is immigration. Immigrants are flocking to the United States during this time period, and mostly it's because of industrialization. We're building more and more factories. We need coal mines to be able to fuel those factories and to produce coke to make the steel that are going to make all the products, etc., etc., etc. So all of this is happening during the political era. The ethnic group that's flocking to the United States in the biggest numbers are the Irish. And so it's at this time that the Irish really become connected to policing. And this is going to remain true, we could argue that in some ways there's an Irish tradition in policing today, but my policing professors when I was an undergraduate were all former New York City police officers, and their names were Sullivan, Donovan, and Walsh. Well, it goes without saying that St. Patrick's Day was a big celebration for those guys in our department because they were all Irish cops. And so their families had immigrated to the United States, decades before they were born, but nonetheless, there was a tradition of, especially in northeastern and midwestern United States, of Irish being the police. And so where did that come from? Well, the Irish, as I said, are really coming to America right around the time of the growth of police departments. There's a potato famine that hits Ireland that devastates the island. They're still producing a lot of food, but it's all being exported by the British who control Ireland at the time. And the British aren't allowing the people of Ireland to really, during the famine, for 3 years the potatoes, the main staple of the Irish diet, is wiped out. So your choices in Ireland basically during the 1840s, during the potato famine, were you try to survive in Ireland, which was really tough, or you leave. And America was beckoning for the Irish to come, but they were treated as not even second class, more like third class citizens. They were seen as the scum of the earth. And so when they came to the United States, they found the same kind of discrimination. But as these cities were growing and we had industrialization and urbanization, there was a greater need for services to be provided by the city, because the established powers in the cities, the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, these were the people, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, who could really control most of government. They soon realized that with these cities, that even though they would discriminate and put the Irish in slums and keep them there, diseases and other problems didn't stay confined to the slums. They could spread. So they soon realized, not because they were great humanitarians, but because they were concerned for their own health and welfare, they needed to control disease better. And so they created sanitation departments, garbage men, and it was all garbage men back then, not garbage women, but garbage men first came into existence during this time period. Other public service jobs, firefighters, fire departments became more professionalized, but also police. But the WASP didn't want to patrol these sections of the city because that was beneath them. So they let the Irish do it and let them police their own, so to speak, and let them take care of their own. And so what the Irish found was most of the political positions that were higher up, the mayor's office, the city council, the senator, the representative, the governor, all these, the president, obvious, all these were taken up by the WASP, by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So the English, maybe even to some extent the Germans, the Scotch, and the Irish were shut out of it. But the positions that the Irish could take in politics were these lower level city positions, often known as ward, W-A-R-D, ward positions, ward politics. And so these are the local representative in city government. So they might represent a ward, which is, if you're from Philadelphia, you know what wards are, or other cities, maybe a district, maybe it's called a district in your city, but they represented smaller sections of the city. And at first these seemed like nothing political positions, but what the WASP didn't realize is that these positions became very powerful because of patronage. Patronage is when you give out benefits like jobs to people in return for their loyalty. So during this political era in the 1800s, if you wanted a job as a police officer in New York City, you didn't take a civil service test. Instead, you went to your local ward politician and they would give you a job if they were sure that you were going to help them to get reelected again, and you were going to help them to get the kickbacks from all the vice operations that were going on in their area. Things like prostitution, maybe opium dens or other kinds of illegal drug areas, gambling, brothels, all kinds of brothels, these kinds of things. These were the vices that were allowed to go on as long as there were payoffs to the police. So the patronage system said, you will be loyal, you will make sure, your job as a police officer is to make sure I get reelected. So when election time comes around, you're going to disrupt my opponents, etc., etc., etc. And so this very much characterized the political era. That's why we call it that, because there was an incredibly close connection between the politicians and the police. So the political power that the ward politicians developed was by controlling the police, they essentially could control the city as well. And so this is when, the WASP soon realized, wait a minute, these are powerful political positions. But the cat was already out of the bag at that point, and the ward politicians had already acquired a lot of power by controlling the police. And they weren't going to let someone other than the Irish, most likely, since they were also Irish, be police officers. They were going to, if you wanted to be a police officer, you were most likely going to be Irish. So this is why, if you've ever wondered why there are so many Irish police even today, there's that tradition. It largely flows from this time period. Now, some of the elements, we could see things like, obviously, corruption, the kickbacks, those kinds of things. This wasn't unbiased policing. Those principles of policing that we talked about earlier, those were out the door. This was about keeping political power, about getting all the money that they could possibly get from allowing vices, those kinds of things. There was influence, certainly, that you could, again, control the city more through the police than through any of these other public service jobs. So even after neighborhoods in the 1900s were no longer predominantly Irish, new groups had come in like Italians and Jews from Russia and other places into New York, then the police were still largely Irish because they could still control that part of the city. Characteristics of the political era policing: order maintenance, keeping the peace. They didn't see themselves as crime fighters. They saw themselves mainly as walking the beat, keeping the peace. You could do illegal things, but just keep it inside and out of sight. Don't be a nuisance. So you want to have prostitution, keep it inside, pay us off. We won't, as long as it doesn't create a major disturbance out in public, we'll let it go on. So order maintenance was the main style of policing during the political era. Walking the beat was common. They were very close to the public, close to the community, and this was seen especially as a very positive thing.